I am Joshua, 32 years old, and at my dad's retirement party, he thought it'd be funny to introduce me like, this is my son Joshua. Couldn't handle pressure, no degree, no backbone. Before I tell you about how I systematically dismantled his entire corporate legacy without him even knowing it, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. To really understand the weight of that night, you have to picture the Fairfield Country Club on a crisp, biting October evening. This wasn't just a dinner, it was a coronation. The main ballroom was glowing under massive, cascading crystal chandeliers that looked like they belonged in a royal palace. There were exactly 200 guests in attendance. These were the elite of the logistics and shipping industry. Men wearing tailored, midnight blue tuxedos that cost more than a reliable used car. Women in sweeping silk gowns, draped in diamonds that caught the light every time they moved. Champagne was flowing like water from an open hydrant, carried on silver trays by waiters who practically moved in synchronization. It was the kind of room where reputations in our city were built, fiercely protected, and quietly destroyed over plates of roasted tenderloin and expensive Pinot Noir. My father, Charles, stood on the main stage beneath a bright, focused spotlight. He had a wireless microphone resting casually in his hand, and he was soaking in the applause like a man who firmly believed he had earned every single drop of it. He was stepping down after 40 years of ruthless climbing in the logistics industry. He was a CEO, an undisputed titan of freight and supply chain, and this was his grand legacy speech. He spent the first 20 minutes thanking his executive board, his biggest clients, and his aggressive legal team. He even looked up to the ceiling and thanked God, which was ironic considering the only higher power my father truly worshipped was quarterly profit margins. Then, he moved on to the family section. He gestured expansively to the front VIP table, right below the stage. "My incredible wife, Linda," he said, his voice deep and smooth. The room erupted in polite, warm applause. Linda smiled, adjusting her sapphire necklace, playing the part of the devoted, perfect matriarch flawlessly. Then he pointed to the man sitting next to her. "My son, Carter, the incoming CEO of Evans Logistics." The room didn't just applaud. They gave a standing ovation. Carter stood up, buttoning his custom-tailored jacket, waving to the crowd with that polished, empty, politician-like smile he'd been practicing in the mirror since he was 16. He looked exactly like the kind of man born on third base who thought he had hit a triple. And then my father's eyes scanned the room, moving past the VIP section, past the middle tables, until they found me sitting near the back, near the kitchen doors. There was a smile on his face. It was the exact same smile I had seen since I was a little boy trying to show him a good report card. To the crowd, it looked warm and fatherly. But to me, knowing the man behind the mask, I knew it was razor-sharp underneath. It was the smile of a predator playing with its food. "And of course, my other son Joshua," he said, the microphone carrying his voice perfectly to every corner of the massive room. He paused. He let the silence hang in the air for a long, heavy 3 seconds, just long enough to sharpen the knife before he drove it in. "Not everyone is cut out for pressure," he continued, a mock sympathetic sigh escaping his lips. "Some people try business school and quickly realize they just don't have the stomach or the backbone for the real world. No degree, no real ambition to speak of. But hey, at least he managed to put on a suit and show up tonight. Let's give him a hand for trying." The room laughed. 200 wealthy, successful people chuckled at my expense. It started as a ripple and turned into a wave of condescending amusement. I sat there in my standard-issue black suit, holding a heavy crystal glass of champagne that I hadn't taken a single sip of. My heart was pounding against my ribs, but on the outside, I was stone. I didn't flinch. I didn't shift uncomfortably in my seat. I didn't let my jaw tighten or my eyes drop. I refused to give him the satisfaction of a visible reaction. I had spent a lifetime practicing how to be invisible, and tonight I was going to use it. He kept talking, his voice as smooth as aged bourbon. "Maybe one day he'll figure things out. Until then, we keep him around for the entertainment value." More laughter rippled through the ballroom. People at the tables near me were actively turning their heads to look at me, their faces caught between pity and amusement. That was the exact moment the final thread snapped. I pushed my chair back. The harsh, scraping sound of the wooden legs dragging against the pristine hardwood floor sliced through the lingering laughter like a siren. The room went dead quiet. 200 pairs of eyes immediately shifted from the stage toward the back table. I stood up slowly, deliberately. I raised my crystal glass, pointing it directly toward the stage where my father was standing. His confident smile faltered for a fraction of a second, his eyes narrowing slightly as he realized I was going off script. "Congratulations on the retirement, Dad," I said. My voice was calm, steady, and incredibly loud. I didn't need a microphone. It carried perfectly across the dead-silent room, bouncing off the high ceilings. "You taught me a lot about business. You taught me about loyalty. And most importantly, you taught me exactly when it is time to walk away from a bad investment." Absolute silence. You could hear the faint hum of the industrial air conditioning overhead. I lifted the glass a few inches higher, staring dead into his eyes. "Cheers. This is the last time any of you will see me." I didn't throw the drink in his face. I didn't scream or curse. I just set the full glass down gently on the white linen tablecloth, the soft clink echoing loudly. I turned my back to the stage, pushed open the heavy oak doors of the ballroom, and walked out into the cool October air. I handed my ticket to the valet and drove away, leaving 200 of the city's most powerful people sitting frozen, completely silent, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Before I tell you how that single exit was the beginning of the end for Evans Logistics, we have to go back 12 years. We have to go back to the exact day my father officially calculated my worth and decided I was entirely expendable. My mother passed away from an incredibly aggressive form of breast cancer when I was just 8 years old. It was fast, it was brutal, and it didn't give our family any time to prepare or say the things we needed to say. I don't remember the sound of her voice very clearly anymore, but I remember the overwhelming smell of antiseptic in her hospital room. Most of all, I remember her hands. They were always warm, despite the illness, and they were always holding on to mine tightly, like she was desperately trying to anchor me to the earth before she was forced to leave it. The funeral was a blur of black umbrellas, heavy rain, and pitying looks from my father's business associates. But the mourning period in the Grand Evans household didn't last long. My father was not a man who tolerated empty spaces in his life or his schedule. Barely 2 years later, he remarried. Linda walked into our sprawling, 6-bedroom colonial house, bringing with her a cloud of expensive floral perfume and a complete disregard for anything that came before her. She didn't come alone. She brought her son from a previous marriage, Carter, who was 3 years older than me. Her divorce had left her hungry for stability, and my father's massive bank account provided exactly that. Within a matter of months, it became painfully obvious that Linda and Carter weren't just new additions trying to blend into our family. They were the family. Carter adapted to our sudden wealth with terrifying natural speed. He was charming in a superficial way, played varsity lacrosse, and knew exactly how to talk to my father's wealthy business associates, laughing at their jokes and maintaining confident eye contact. My father looked at Carter and saw a blank canvas. He saw the exact version of a son he had always wanted to mold, a charismatic frontman for his corporate empire. The contrast in how we were treated wasn't just noticeable. It was something you could actively measure. Carter would bring home B- and C+ grades from his expensive private high school, and my father would praise him for his well-rounded social life and networking skills. I brought home straight A's, won state-level math competitions, and was met with a distracted nod from behind the morning newspaper. The disparities grew wider and more expensive. On Carter's 16th birthday, a brand-new, silver Porsche 911 appeared in our massive driveway, complete with a massive red bow on the hood. I watched from my bedroom window as my father handed him the keys, clapping him on the back. 2 years later, when I turned 16, I inherited Carter's old, dented sedan that smelled faintly of stale beer. Linda played her part flawlessly. She was the ultimate manipulator, operating purely in the shadows. In front of guests or extended family, she would rest a perfectly manicured hand on my shoulder and call me her sweet, quiet boy. But when the heavy wooden front doors closed, she orchestrated my complete erasure from the family dynamic. If my father invited us to a high-profile business dinner to learn the ropes, Linda would smoothly intercept. "Charles, honey," she would say, her voice dripping with fake maternal concern. "Joshua has that big calculus exam coming up. He really needs to stay home and focus on his academics. We don't want to overwhelm him with business talk, do we?" My father, eager to avoid any domestic friction, always agreed. "Right? Good thinking, Linda. Joshua, hit the books. Carter, grab your coat. You're coming with me to meet the regional distributors." I became a ghost haunting my own childhood home. There was no physical abuse, no screaming matches that you see in movies. It was much worse. It was the absolute crushing weight of total apathy. The real breaking point, the moment the illusion shattered completely, happened when I was 20 years old. I was in my sophomore year at a solid, respectable business school. I was carrying a 3.8 GPA. For the first time in my entire life, I felt like I was thriving. I had discovered a deep, consuming passion for supply chain analytics. I loved the complex mechanics of how things moved across the country, the mathematical efficiency of routing systems, the raw logic of it all. Then, on a random, rainy Wednesday afternoon, my father called my cell phone. He told me to pack a weekend bag and come home immediately. He said we needed a family meeting. In a household entirely devoid of warmth, those two words were never followed by good news. I walked into his mahogany-paneled study. The walls were lined top to bottom with framed industry awards, photographs of him shaking hands with politicians, and plaques commemorating record-breaking fiscal years. He was sitting behind his massive, custom-built oak desk. Linda was standing right behind his thick leather chair, resting her hands on his shoulders, acting as a silent, physical endorsement of whatever was about to happen. Carter wasn't in the room. That should have been my first major clue. "Joshua," my father started, not even bothering to look up from the thick financial file folder open on his desk. "Take a seat. We need to make a strategic financial decision regarding the family's future." Strategic. That was his favorite word. It meant he had removed all human emotion from the equation. "Carter has officially been accepted into the MBA program at Wharton," my father continued, finally looking up and meeting my eyes. "It is a massive opportunity. It's a critical investment that is going to secure the future of Evans Logistics when he eventually takes over the helm." I felt the blood drain from my face. My stomach dropped, plummeting to the floor, because my analytical brain had already run the numbers and I knew exactly where this conversation was heading. "We've looked closely at the capital projections for the next 2 years," he said, his voice entirely devoid of warmth or hesitation. "And the reality is we simply cannot comfortably fund both your undergraduate tuition and his advanced program at the same time. The liquid capital is tied up in new warehouse acquisitions. So we've made the decision that you will be taking a break from your college program. Just temporarily, of course." Linda offered me a soft, deeply sympathetic smile that absolutely did not reach her cold, calculating eyes. "You can always go back and finish your degree later, sweetheart. Carter's timeline is just a bit more critical right now for the company's succession plan." I stared at my father, my chest tightening. I thought about the college fund. "You promised Mom," I said, my voice shaking just a little bit before I steadied it. "Before she died, you promised her you would support my education. There was a fund." My father's jaw clenched. A flash of irritation crossed his face. He hated being reminded of his first wife, of promises made to a dying woman. "Circumstances change, Joshua. The market changes. Carter is an investment in our legacy. You need to understand the ROI here. I need returns on the money I spend. Return on investment. That's what I was to him. A line item on a spreadsheet. A bad investment that needed to be liquidated." I didn't yell. I didn't flip the heavy oak desk. I didn't cry or beg for him to reconsider. I sat there in the heavy silence and realized, with absolute, terrifying clarity, that if I stayed, I would spend the rest of my life begging for scraps from a man who didn't even want me in his house. I stood up. "I understand," I said simply. I walked upstairs to my room, packed a single canvas duffel bag with a few changes of clothes, took the $200 I had saved from a summer landscaping job, and walked out the front door. I didn't look back at the Porsche in the driveway. He wanted ROI. Fine. I was going to build an empire out of nothing, and I was going to make sure he never got to claim a single percentage of it. Rock bottom is never cinematic. It doesn't come with a dramatic soundtrack or rain pouring dramatically over your face. Rock bottom is incredibly quiet, and it smells like stale grease and cheap, powdered laundry detergent. I took a Greyhound bus to Boston, leaving Connecticut and the Evans name far behind me. My first apartment wasn't really an apartment. It was a cramped, freezing 400-square-foot studio located directly above a 24-hour laundromat in a rough part of town. The walls were so paper-thin I could hear my neighbors arguing about fantasy football and unpaid bills at 2 in the morning. The radiator in the corner clanged violently, like it was angry at the world, but barely put out any heat. I couldn't afford a bed frame or real furniture, so I slept on a used mattress directly on the hard linoleum floor for the first 6 months. Survival became my only metric. I took a job opening up a local corner cafe at 4:30 in the morning. I spent 4 hours serving toasted bagels and burning hot coffee to miserable commuters, smelling like roasted beans and exhaustion. Then, in the afternoons, I managed to land a low-paying, minimum-wage administrative assistant job at a small, gritty regional logistics firm. The owner of the firm was a gruff, blunt, cigar-chewing guy named Wyatt. My job was entirely entry-level. Answering phones, filing physical shipping manifests, and staring at computer screens waiting for drivers to check in. No one in that cramped, chaotic office knew my last name meant anything. I was just Joshua, the quiet kid who refilled the printer toner and didn't complain. And that anonymity was exactly what I needed. I was a blank slate. I started staying late at the office. Long after the loud dispatchers went home to their families, I would sit at my tiny, cluttered desk and watch the primary routing software on the main terminal. I watched how the massive freight trucks were dispatched across the Northeast Corridor. I studied how warehouse inventory was staggered, and more importantly, my brain automatically started calculating where Wyatt's company was bleeding money through sheer, unnoticed inefficiency. One night, around 9:30 p.m., Wyatt walked out of his private office, coat over his arm, and caught me staring intensely at the complex route map glowing on my monitor. He frowned, his thick eyebrows knitting together. "You ask way too many questions for a kid who's just supposed to answer the damn phone," Wyatt grumbled, leaning his heavy frame against my desk. "I like knowing how the machine works," I replied simply, not looking away from the screen. "Your LTL freight consolidation on the I-95 corridor is costing you a fortune in deadhead miles." Wyatt looked at me for a long, quiet moment. He didn't yell. He didn't fire me for overstepping. Instead, he reached over my shoulder, typed his master administrative password into the terminal, and unlocked the deep back-end analytics of the software. "Don't break my company, kid," he said, and then he walked out. That was all the permission I needed. I started legally stealing knowledge. I couldn't afford a Wharton tuition like Carter, but the internet was free and I had an obsessive drive. I spent my nights back in my freezing apartment, huddled under a blanket, taking free open-source courses from MIT. I studied complex supply chain modeling, advanced operations research, linear programming, and predictive analytics until my eyes burned and the sun came up. I built massive, intricate spreadsheets on a laptop that overheated if I ran more than 2 programs at once. I realized very quickly that my father was completely wrong about me. I wasn't just okay at business. I possessed a terrifying, natural genius for systems. Systems are completely honest. Numbers don't lie, they don't play favorites, and they don't care who your mother was. Within 2 years, I wasn't an administrative assistant anymore. I was secretly rerouting Wyatt's entire fleet. I optimized carrier negotiations and completely overhauled his inventory management. By year 3, I had saved his firm over $500,000 in wasted fuel and overtime pay. I was acting as a shadow operations manager, and Wyatt paid me handsomely for it with a massive promotion and a salary bump. But I didn't want to build someone else's company forever. By my 4th year in Boston, I had saved up every single spare penny. I ate ramen, I walked to work, I lived like a monk. And finally, I had enough capital to quietly register my own consulting firm, Meridian Strategic Logistics, LLC. It started with just me, my refurbished laptop, and a rented, noisy desk in a shared co-working space in Back Bay. I kept my name completely off all public records. I hired a proxy legal service to handle the incorporation. If you searched for Meridian online, you found a sleek, minimalist website promising aggressive efficiency metrics, a contact email, and absolutely no photos of the founder. No flashy LinkedIn profiles, no press releases. I knew my father's ego and his reach. If Charles ever caught wind that the son he kicked out was building a rival firm in his specific industry, he would use his immense capital and vendor leverage to crush me before I even secured my second client. Invisibility was my greatest armor. Meridian grew slowly at first, but with lethal effectiveness. We took on small, struggling regional distributors, companies on the brink of bankruptcy. We came in quietly, analyzed their broken, bleeding systems, and ruthlessly fixed them. We cut operational waste by 18% here, reduced shipping redundancy by 22% there. Word of mouth spread like wildfire among CFOs in the Northeast. By the time I turned 31, I had moved out of the co-working space and into a beautiful, high-rise office in downtown Boston. I had a dedicated team of 12 elite data analysts working under me. Meridian was quietly, efficiently pulling in $3.8 million in annual revenue. On my 31st birthday, a standard white envelope arrived at my office. It had been forwarded multiple times from an old address. Inside was a generic, store-bought birthday card. The printed text said, "Happy birthday to a great son." It was signed by Linda in her loopy handwriting, and inside was a check for $100 from my father's personal account. It was an insult. It was the absolute bare minimum effort required to convince themselves they weren't terrible people. I stood by the window, looking out over the Boston harbor. I didn't feel anger. I just felt cold resolve. I walked over to the heavy-duty industrial shredder in the corner of my office, fed the card and the check directly into the steel blades, and listened to the satisfying, mechanical hum as it shredded my past into tiny, unrecognizable pieces. In the cold, calculating environment of the Evans family, there was only one person who ever truly saw me as a human being, not a spreadsheet asset. That was my grandmother, Margaret Evans. She was Charles's mother, but she carried a fierce, old-world integrity that her son completely lacked. She was the one who used to call me every Sunday night to ask about my life, my ideas, and my dreams. She laughed when I told her I reorganized my high school debate team's travel schedule to save the school money. "You see the invisible lines connecting the world, Joshua," she told me once. "Don't ever let that arrogant son of mine convince you you're blind." When she passed away, I felt a profound, hollow ache. It felt like the last genuine thread connecting me to the concept of family had snapped. I flew back to Connecticut for the funeral. I stood in the very back of the cemetery, near the wrought iron gates, wearing a dark coat and sunglasses. I watched my father deliver a tearful eulogy about family values, fighting the urge to be sick. I refused to approach them, leaving before the casket was even lowered. A week later, the silence of my Boston office was broken by a phone call from an upscale, private estate law firm. A senior lawyer named Samuel requested my presence immediately. I sat in Samuel's plush, intimidating office overlooking the city, confused as to why I was there. Samuel, an older man with sharp eyes, pushed a thick, heavy legal binder across his polished mahogany desk. "Joshua," Samuel began, his voice highly professional, "your grandmother, Margaret, established a private irrevocable trust fund in your name exactly 8 years ago. She left very explicit legal instructions that absolutely no one in your immediate family, specifically your father, be informed of its existence until after her passing. I stared at the thick stack of paperwork, my heart thumping. "How much?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. $800,000, Samuel replied smoothly. "And the trust is structured so it cannot be contested by the estate. It is entirely yours. She also left you this letter." He handed me a sealed, cream-colored envelope. My hands actually shook as I broke the wax seal. The handwriting inside was frail, but the words carried the weight of a sledgehammer. "My dearest Joshua, I know everything. I know exactly what Charles did to you. I know he drained your mother's college fund to pay for that arrogant, empty-headed boy of Linda's. I fought him on it until I lost my voice, but your father's pride is a terminal sickness. I quietly moved my personal assets into this trust away from his greedy hands. This inheritance is yours. No strings attached. Use it to build the empire they told you that you weren't smart enough to build. I have always believed in you, my brilliant boy." I sat in that intimidating lawyer's office, buried my face in my hands, and for the first time in 12 years, I cried. It wasn't about the money. I already had money. It was the absolute, undeniable validation. It was the proof that I wasn't crazy, that the cruelty I experienced was real, and that someone in that freezing house had loved me enough to protect me from beyond the grave. I took that $800,000 inheritance and injected it directly into the veins of Meridian. I hired top-tier senior analysts from rival firms. I invested in proprietary AI routing software. We transformed from a successful regional firm into a phantom powerhouse in the logistics consulting world. And then, roughly 3 years ago, the universe delivered the ultimate poetic punchline. My CFO, a brilliant and ruthless guy named Elijah, walked into my office and dropped a massive request for proposal, RFP, on my desk. A major legacy logistics company was hemorrhaging money. Their middle management was bloated and lazy, their vendor contracts were bleeding them dry, and their routing infrastructure was stuck in the 1990s. They were desperately looking for a silent, highly effective consulting firm to come in and restructure their entire operation before their board of directors initiated a hostile takeover. I looked at the cover sheet of the RFP. The client name was printed in bold, black letters. Evans Logistics. I leaned back in my chair and laughed. The irony was so sharp it was practically lethal. My father, the man who told me I had no head for business, the man who cut my education, was unknowingly begging my phantom company to save his sinking legacy. "Do we take it?" Elijah asked, raising an eyebrow. He knew my history. "We take it," I said, "but strict protocols. Everything goes through legal proxies. Virtual meetings only, cameras off. They deal with you, not me." For 18 grueling months, my team and I surgically gutted my father's inefficient, outdated systems. We ruthlessly fired redundant middle managers. We aggressively renegotiated toxic carrier contracts. We built them a brand new, highly efficient digital infrastructure. The results were staggering. Meridian improved Evans Logistics' operational efficiency by a massive 40%. We saved them millions of dollars in wasted revenue and single-handedly stabilized their falling stock price. We became the invisible backbone of his empire. And my father, sitting in his corner office, had absolutely no idea that the savior of his legacy was the very son he had thrown away like garbage. Which brings us directly back to the present. To the deafening silence following my dramatic exit from the Fairfield Country Club retirement party. When I walked out of that ballroom, I didn't just leave a party. I initiated a carefully calculated countdown. The very next morning, my personal phone began blowing up with texts from aunts, uncles, and cousins I hadn't spoken to in over a decade. Linda had gone to work immediately, aggressively spinning a narrative to protect my father's pristine public image. The texts read things like, "Joshua, we heard you had a terrible mental breakdown at the party. Your dad is so worried about you." And, "Sweetie, Linda said you were acting unstable and aggressive. Please get psychiatric help." They were desperately trying to frame my calm, calculated exit as the erratic behavior of an unstable, jealous son who couldn't handle his brother's success. If I was just crazy, then anything I said could be dismissed. If I was having a breakdown, then my father remained the tragic, long-suffering victim. It was textbook gaslighting. I didn't reply to a single message. I let them build their little house of cards, fully aware that I was holding the match that would burn it down. You see, the timing of the retirement party wasn't just a coincidence for me. My father was stepping down, and Carter was officially taking the reins as CEO. But what Carter and my father were desperately sweating over in private was that Meridian's consulting contract with Evans Logistics was up for renewal in exactly 30 days. They had already sent over a panicked proposal to lock us in for another 5-year extension, offering a massive increase in our consulting fees. They were completely, utterly dependent on our proprietary software and our daily operational oversight. If Meridian walked away, Evans Logistics would lose 40% of its operational capacity overnight. It would be catastrophic. Carter's first quarter as CEO wouldn't just be bad. It would be a bloodbath. The board of directors would eat him alive. I sat in my corner office with Elijah, looking out over the Boston skyline. He pushed the lucrative renewal contract across my desk. "If we pull the plug, Joshua," Elijah warned, though he had a slight smile on his face, "they drop within a quarter. Cash flow tightens instantly. Carter's tenure becomes a disaster class in mismanagement." I picked up my heavy fountain pen. "Draft the termination notice. Standard 30-day exit clause. Cite strategic portfolio realignment. Ensure there is zero legal exposure for us." Elijah grinned, a predatory look in his eyes. "With pleasure." But a cold, corporate termination notice delivered by lawyers wasn't enough. Not after what he did in that ballroom. I needed my father to understand exactly why his empire was suddenly crumbling to dust. I pulled out a piece of heavy, watermarked corporate stationery and wrote a personal letter directly to Charles. "Dad, at your party you told 200 of your closest friends that I wasn't built for pressure. You said I didn't have what it takes to survive in your world. I want you to look very, very closely at the signature on the attached legal documents. Meridian Strategic Logistics is mine." The explosion happened at exactly 10:14 a.m. the next day. My desk phone buzzed. It was my executive assistant. "Sir, there are 3 people in the lobby demanding to see you. They bypassed security. They are extremely agitated. Send them to conference room A," I said smoothly, not even looking up from my laptop. Conference room A was located right in the middle of the office floor, completely surrounded by floor-to-ceiling glass walls. Every single one of my 30 employees could see inside. I wanted total transparency. I wanted an audience. I took my time getting coffee before I walked into the room. Charles, Linda, and Carter were standing by the window. The smug arrogance from the ballroom was completely, entirely gone. Charles looked pale, aged 10 years overnight, and genuinely terrified. Carter was sweating profusely, pacing back and forth like a trapped animal. Linda's perfect mask of makeup couldn't hide the absolute panic stretching across her face. "Joshua," my father choked out as I closed the glass door. He was clutching the termination letter in his shaking hand. "Tell me this is a prank. Tell me this is some kind of sick, elaborate revenge joke." I walked over to the head of the long glass table, pulled out the chair, and sat down comfortably. "No joke, Dad. Just ROI. Remember? I'm liquidating a bad investment." Carter slammed his palms down on the glass table, his face flushed red. "You cannot do this. We desperately need Meridian's routing software. Our entire Northeastern fleet runs on your algorithm. If you pull out now, the board will literally fire me before I even unpack my office." "That sounds like a severe management issue, Carter," I replied coldly, leaning back. Maybe Evans Logistics should have hired a CEO with a degree who actually understands supply chain mechanics, instead of just the guy who played lacrosse and has a nice smile. Linda stepped forward, tears rapidly pooling in her eyes, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "Joshua, please, be reasonable. We are family. You can't just destroy your father's life's work over a silly little misunderstanding at a party." "It wasn't a misunderstanding, Linda," I snapped, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous, vibrating register that silenced her instantly. It was the absolute truth. He showed everyone exactly who he is. And now, I'm showing him exactly who I am. My father looked at me, raw desperation leaking out of his pores. He stepped forward, abandoning all his pride. What do you want? Name your price, Joshua. I'll give you a permanent seat on the board. I'll give you 20% equity in Evans Logistics. I'll triple your current consulting fee. Just don't pull the software. I looked at the man who had dismissed my entire existence for 3 decades. I don't want your money, Dad. I don't want your toxic equity. And I definitely do not want a seat at your table. I built my own table. I stood up, buttoning my suit jacket. The termination stands. You have exactly 30 days to figure out how to run your own company without me holding your hand. This meeting is over. Get out of my office. They walked out. They had to walk past my entire team of brilliant analysts, completely humiliated, utterly defeated, their empire crumbling beneath their feet. This is a moment that changed everything, when I finally regained control of my life. Thank you for your patience in getting this far. You are amazing. Please help me like the video and leave a comment with the number 1 below so I know you've been with me this far. This will not only help more people find this story, but also let me know that my experiences are meaningful to someone. Your support is the biggest motivation for me to continue sharing the rest of this journey. The fallout was faster, uglier, and far more brutal than even my most aggressive predictive models had calculated. When Meridian officially disconnected our servers and revoked their access to our routing algorithms exactly 30 days later, the impact on Evans Logistics was catastrophic and immediate. Without our predictive AI and automated vendor management systems, their supply chain instantly turned into a bottleneck nightmare. Shipments were delayed by days. Furious clients were screaming on the phones. Fuel costs skyrocketed overnight because drivers were taking horribly inefficient routes. I sat in my quiet, serene office and watched the industry news tickers flash red across my monitors. 2 weeks after the split, my personal cell phone rang. It was Christopher, one of my father's oldest business partners and a major stakeholder in Evans Logistics. I had met him a few times as a kid. He sounded frantic, out of breath. Joshua, what the hell is going on over there? Christopher demanded, skipping the pleasantries. Charles is scrambling like a madman. The company is bleeding cash. Is the rumor true? Are you seriously the guy behind Meridian? I am, I said simply, taking a sip of my coffee. Why in God's name did you pull the contract? He's your father. You're tanking the stock. He made a strict business decision 12 years ago that my education wasn't a worthwhile investment. I replied, my voice perfectly steady, completely devoid of emotion. I just made a strict business decision that Evans Logistics is no longer a viable, stable client for my firm's portfolio. It's strictly business, Christopher. You understand ROI, don't you? Christopher went dead silent. He was a corporate shark, and sharks immediately recognize blood in the water. Good God, he muttered, his voice dropping. Carter has absolutely no idea what he's doing over there. Does he? No, I said calmly. He doesn't have the slightest clue. Within 2 agonizing months, the internal crisis exploded into the public domain. Evans Logistics was forced to issue a press release announcing a massive strategic restructuring. They laid off 70 hardworking employees right before the Thanksgiving holidays just to stop the financial hemorrhaging. Major legacy clients, seeing the massive drop in performance metrics, started exercising their exit clauses, canceling their long-term contracts and moving their freight to competitors. Carter's first quarter as the newly minted CEO was an unmitigated disaster. The board of directors held an emergency, closed-door meeting. They didn't fire him immediately. That would have been too publicly embarrassing for Charles, but they effectively neutered him. They stripped Carter of all his actual decision-making power, bringing in an aggressive outside crisis management firm to babysit him. Carter became a CEO in name only, a glorified, highly paid mascot sitting in a massive corner office while the company burned to the ground around him. But the financial ruin, the loss of wealth, wasn't the worst part for my father. It was the public humiliation. In the elite, insulated business circles of our city, secrets simply do not stay secret. The story of the retirement party, how Charles had arrogantly mocked his own son on stage, only to discover weeks later that the very same son owned the company keeping him from total bankruptcy, spread like a wildfire through the country clubs and boardrooms. I heard from a reliable industry colleague that Charles attended an annual logistics gala a few months later. He walked into the grand ballroom, expecting the usual deferential handshakes and backslapping. Instead, people politely but quickly excused themselves when he approached. He ended up sitting at his expensive VIP table, eating his catered dinner almost entirely alone. People in our industry are ruthless, yes, but they deeply respect loyalty and competence. When other powerful CEOs looked at Charles now, they didn't just see a man whose company was losing millions. They saw a man who was so blinded by arrogance that he had actively tried to destroy his own flesh and blood. They saw a massive liability. Disloyalty in business is a highly contagious disease, and absolutely no one wanted to catch what Charles Evans had. Sitting in my office, looking at the success I had built, I didn't celebrate their downfall. I didn't pop a bottle of champagne or gloat to my employees. I just felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace and finality. My grandmother Margaret had been absolutely right all those years ago. Sometimes you don't actually have to actively destroy the people who hurt you. You don't need to seek revenge. You just have to stop carrying them, stop holding them up, and simply step out of their way. Gravity, and their own incompetence, will do the rest of the work for you. I had spent my entire adult life quietly trying to prove that I was worthy of occupying a small space in my father's world. By walking away and letting his house of cards collapse under its own weight, I finally realized something incredibly freeing. His world was incredibly small, pathetic, and fragile, and I had outgrown it a very long time ago. 6 months after the complete and total severance of the Meridian contract, my life had settled into a quiet, focused rhythm. The chaotic noise of my father's collapsing empire had faded into the background, becoming nothing more than occasional headlines in local business journals. I was no longer checking the industry news tickers. I was no longer interested in the daily stock price of Evans Logistics. They were no longer my problem. I had successfully excised the tumor from my life, and I was finally learning what it felt like to breathe without the constant, suffocating weight of my father's expectations pressing down on my chest. But just when you think you have completely closed a chapter, the past has a funny way of knocking on your door to deliver one final, devastating footnote. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon in April. The Boston skyline was hidden behind thick, gray clouds, and the rain was lashing aggressively against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office. My assistant knocked softly on my door and told me I had a personal phone call on line 2. She said the man on the phone claimed to be my uncle, David. I stared at the blinking red light on my desk phone. Uncle David was my father's younger brother, but in the grand, carefully curated narrative of the Evans family, he practically did not exist. David was the black sheep. He was an architect, an artist, a man who built low-income housing projects instead of pursuing ruthless corporate monopolies. My father despised him for his lack of ambition, and had quietly pushed him out of the family circle decades ago. I had not spoken to David since I was a teenager. I picked up the receiver. David? It's Joshua. Hello, Joshua. His voice came through the line, raspy and tired, sounding so much older than I remembered. I know this is incredibly sudden. I know we haven't spoken in years, but I've been reading the industry news. I saw what happened with your father's company. I heard the rumors about Meridian. The rumors are completely true, I said flatly, offering no apologies. It was a business decision. I know it was, David replied, his tone entirely free of the judgment I had expected. And I am not calling to defend Charles. I am calling because there is something you need to know. Something I should have told you 12 years ago, but I was a coward. I need to see you in person, Joshua. Today. There was an urgency in his voice that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I agreed to meet him at a quiet, out-of-the-way diner in South Boston, far away from the financial district and the prying eyes of corporate executives. When I walked into the diner an hour later, the smell of cheap coffee and frying bacon filled the air. I spotted David sitting in a back booth. He looked fragile. His hair was completely white, and he wore a faded corduroy jacket. He looked nothing like the polished, aggressive men in the Evans family. He looked like a man carrying a very heavy secret. I slid into the vinyl booth across from him. We didn't exchange pleasantries. He pushed a manila envelope across the sticky table toward me. "When your father told you that he didn't have the liquid capital to pay for your tuition," David began, staring down at his black coffee. "When he told you that Carter was the better investment and that you had to drop out of school, do you remember what you said to him?" "I told him he promised my mother," I answered, the memory still bitter on my tongue. "I reminded him about the college fund she wanted to set up before she died." David looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "She didn't just want to set it up, Joshua. She did set it up." The diner around me seemed to instantly drop in temperature. I stopped breathing for a second. "What are you talking about?" "Your mother, Sarah, was a brilliant woman," David said softly, "and she was far more observant than Charles ever gave her credit for. When she got sick, she knew her time was terribly short. She also knew exactly who your father was. She knew that Charles only valued things he could control. She was terrified that if she died, you would be left completely at his mercy." David reached out and tapped the manila envelope. "In the last few months of her life, she secretly liquidated a significant portion of her own family inheritance. She didn't use an aggressive corporate lawyer because she didn't want to alert Charles. She quietly set up a dedicated college fund entirely in your name. It was enough money to cover 4 full years of tuition at any Ivy League university in the country, plus living expenses. She wanted to guarantee that no matter what Charles did, your education and your future would be absolutely secure." My hands felt numb. I stared at the envelope, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. "If the fund existed," I said, my voice sounding distant and hollow, "then why was I kicked out of school? Where did the money go?" David swallowed hard. He looked disgusted, deeply ashamed of his own bloodline. "Because she was a wife, not a lawyer," David explained, the pain evident in every syllable. "She set the account up, but because she passed away while you were still a minor, Charles automatically became the legal custodian of that specific account. For years, he ignored it. But then Linda came along. Then Carter needed a car. Then Carter needed his Wharton tuition paid for. And Charles's own assets were tied up in a bad warehouse acquisition. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with terrifying, sickening clarity. He drained it," I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow to the stomach. "He drained every single penny of it," David confirmed, his voice breaking. "Charles took the money your dying mother specifically set aside for your survival, and he used it to buy Carter that silver Porsche. He used it to pay for Carter's Wharton degree. He used your mother's final act of love to fund his stepson's life. And then he sat in his study, looked you dead in the eye, and told you there simply wasn't enough money for your education. I sat in that diner booth, completely paralyzed. The world outside the rain-streaked window seemed to completely stop spinning. For 12 years, I had believed a very specific narrative. I believed that my father had simply looked at a spreadsheet, evaluated my worth against Carter's, and decided I wasn't a good investment. I had made peace with being deprioritized. I had accepted that I was just the backup plan, the expendable child. But this was entirely different. I wasn't just overlooked. I was deliberately, systematically robbed. My father hadn't just denied me a future. He had actively stolen the shield my mother had built for me and handed it to a stranger. "Margaret knew," David continued quietly, referring to my grandmother. "She found out about the college fund a year after you left for Boston. She had a screaming match with Charles that shook the foundation of that house. She threatened to expose him to the entire family. That is exactly why she hired Samuel, the most ruthless estate lawyer in Boston, to set up that irrevocable trust fund for you. She knew she couldn't recover the money Charles stole from your mother, but she made absolutely certain he could never touch the wealth she was leaving you. Everything finally made perfect sense. The urgency surrounding Carter's MBA program. The cold, mechanical way my father had dismissed me from his study. The fiercely protective letter my grandmother had left with my inheritance. It wasn't just familial preference. It was a massive, unforgivable theft. "Why are you telling me this now, David?" I asked, my voice barely a raspy whisper. "Why wait 12 years? Because your father's empire is currently burning to the ground," David said firmly, his eyes locking onto mine. "And I know that society and the extended family will eventually try to pressure you into feeling guilty. They will tell you to forgive him. They will tell you to step in and save him because he is your father. I needed you to have the absolute, undeniable truth in your hands. I needed you to know that you owe that man absolutely nothing. The truth belongs to you, Joshua, not to him." I took the manila envelope. Inside were the old bank statements, the transfer records, the undeniable paper trail of a father stealing from his own son. I thanked David, paid for his coffee, and walked out into the pouring rain. I didn't go back to the office that afternoon. I drove to my apartment, locked the door, and completely broke down. I wept for the 8-year-old boy holding his dying mother's hand in that sterile hospital room. I wept for the 20-year-old kid packing his single duffel bag, believing he was entirely worthless. The anger I felt was no longer a sharp, driving force. It was a deep, bottomless ocean of grief. That revelation, the final puzzle piece of my father's true nature, was the catalyst that finally pushed me into therapy. For over a decade, I had used my work as a perfectly constructed suit of armor. I had built Meridian Strategic Logistics not just as a business but as a fortress. I believed that if I became successful enough, wealthy enough, and powerful enough, the rejection of my past could never touch me again. But sitting in that diner with Uncle David made me realize that armor is incredibly heavy. You can survive inside a fortress, but you cannot truly live in one. A month later, I found myself sitting in the calm, neutrally decorated office of Dr. Julian, a highly respected clinical psychologist in Beacon Hill. Dr. Julian was a perceptive, quiet man who specialized in high-performing executives dealing with complex family trauma. He didn't offer me cheap platitudes or tell me to just let it go. He listened to my entire story, the party, the college fund, the secret company, the ultimate revenge. "You present yourself as a man who has completely won the war, Joshua," Dr. Julian said during our third session, adjusting his glasses. "You outsmarted them. You built a superior company. You took back your power. But you are sitting in my office vibrating with tension. Why?" I stared at the intricate pattern on his Persian rug. "Because I don't know how to turn it off. I spent 12 years waiting for the other shoe to drop. I spent 12 years preparing for a fight. Now the fight is completely over. The enemy is defeated, and I have no idea what to do with my hands." "You built extreme competence as a survival mechanism," Dr. Julian explained, his voice incredibly gentle but firm. "When a child is denied basic love and security, they often substitute it with achievement. You believed that if you became undeniably useful, you could not be discarded again. But Joshua, the war is over. Your father has no power over you. He has no money to hold over your head. He has no authority. You do not need to wear the armor to the grocery store anymore." Therapy was the hardest work I have ever done. It was significantly harder than building predictive routing algorithms or negotiating million-dollar carrier contracts. It required me to look at the darkest, most vulnerable parts of myself and admit that I was deeply, profoundly hurt. Over the next year, Dr. Julian helped me systematically dismantle the hypervigilance that had defined my entire adult life. We talked extensively about the concept of the golden child and the scapegoat. We discussed how Linda had manipulated the environment, and how my father's extreme narcissism made him view his children purely as extensions of his own ego. "You didn't just walk away from a family," Dr. Julian told me one afternoon. "You walked away from a cult of personality centered entirely around Charles Evans. and stepping out of that requires deprogramming. As I healed internally, Meridian continued to flourish externally. Without the massive, time-consuming anchor of Evans Logistics draining our resources, my team and I were free to expand into entirely new verticals. We took on major contracts in international freight forwarding and cold chain pharmaceuticals. We hired 10 more elite analysts. I promoted Elijah, giving him a significant equity stake in the company because loyalty and hard work should be rewarded, not exploited. I was no longer working 100-hour weeks out of pure, frantic spite. I was working because I genuinely loved the puzzles of logistics. I started taking actual weekends off. I traveled to Europe, not for business but just to walk through museums and look at the architecture. I started dating again, being completely honest about my past and my boundaries. Meanwhile, the news regarding my former family continued to trickle in, painting a picture of a slow, agonizing collapse. Evans Logistics managed to avoid total bankruptcy, but just barely. They were forced to sell off their most lucrative regional warehouses to a massive conglomerate just to stay afloat. They downsized their corporate headquarters from a sprawling glass high-rise to a modest office park in the suburbs. Carter was quietly asked to resign by the board of directors. His golden boy charm was completely useless when faced with angry shareholders demanding actual operational results. Without his hefty CEO salary and his father's blank checkbook, Carter's expensive lifestyle caught up with him quickly. I heard through the grapevine that his wife filed for divorce, taking full custody of their expensive assets and leaving him scrambling to pay the legal fees. As for my father, the stress of watching his legacy shrink took a massive physical toll on him. He stepped entirely out of the public eye. The man who once craved the spotlight, who needed 200 people to applaud his every word, was now living quietly, managing the shrinking remnants of his wealth. Occasionally, Linda would try to reach out. She would send emails to my corporate address, filled with fake nostalgia and subtle guilt trips. Joshua, your father's health isn't what it used to be. Family should stick together during hard times. Please call us. I never responded. I simply set up a permanent filter to send her emails directly to the trash bin. I didn't hate them anymore. Hate requires a massive amount of energy. Hate is a form of active attachment. It keeps you orbiting around the people who damaged you. I simply felt absolute, profound indifference. They were strangers who shared my DNA, and their drama no longer belonged in my universe. I had finally achieved the ultimate form of freedom. I simply did not care what they thought of me. It was a bright, clear Sunday morning in late May. The air was crisp, and the trees were finally starting to show vibrant green leaves after a long, brutal New England winter. I drove my car, a quiet, reliable SUV, not a flashy sports car, out to the sprawling cemetery in Connecticut. I parked near the iron gates and walked the familiar path up the gentle hill. The cemetery was incredibly peaceful, the only sound being the wind rustling through the ancient oak trees and the distant chirping of birds. I stopped in front of a beautifully polished granite headstone. The engraving read, Margaret Evans, beloved mother, grandmother, and fierce protector. I didn't bring expensive, elaborate bouquets of flowers. I just brought a simple, single white rose, and I laid it gently on the fresh spring grass at the base of the stone. I stood there for a long time, hands buried deep in my coat pockets, just looking at her name. You were right, Grandma, I said quietly, my voice carrying easily in the silent morning air. You were completely right about all of it. The systems, the numbers, the leverage. But most importantly, you were right about the truth. The truth really is enough. I thought about the massive journey of the last 14 years. I thought about the terrified, heartbroken 20-year-old kid dragging a canvas duffel bag out of that grand colonial house, feeling like the absolute dirt on the bottom of his father's expensive Italian shoes. I thought about the freezing apartment above the loud laundromat, the endless nights of staring at MIT OpenCourseWare, the brutal panic of starting a company with nothing but a laptop and an obsessive drive to survive. I thought about the inheritance she had left me. Not the $800,000 in the bank account, though that capital had undeniably built Meridian. The real inheritance Margaret Evans gave me was insulation. She gave me the gift of undeniable proof. She proved that I was worthy of protection, that I was worthy of belief, and that the narrative my father tried to force onto me was a complete lie. I built the empire, I told the headstone, a soft, genuine smile touching my lips. It's clean, it's profitable, and Charles will never, ever get to touch a single brick of it. As I turned and walked slowly back down the hill toward my car, I felt an overwhelming sense of lightness. The massive, invisible backpack of childhood trauma, of constantly trying to prove my worth to a man entirely incapable of recognizing it, was finally gone. I had set it down and I was never going to pick it up again. People constantly misunderstand the concept of boundaries. Society, especially our culture, pushes this toxic narrative that family is everything, that blood is thicker than water, and that you must unconditionally forgive the people who share your last name, no matter how deeply they continuously cut you. We are constantly pressured to keep the peace, to be the bigger person, to swallow our pride and sit at the holiday dinner table with the very people who actively root for our failure. But true boundaries are not about seeking loud, dramatic revenge. A boundary is not a weapon you use to attack someone else. A boundary is a highly secure perimeter you draw around your own mental health, your own peace, and your own life. My father believed that by publicly mocking me, by cutting my education, by stealing from my mother's memory, he was putting me in my designated place. He thought he was teaching me a harsh lesson about power and compliance. What he actually did was hand me the absolute, undeniable key to my own freedom. He completely removed the illusion of a safety net, which forced me to learn how to fly on my own. He confirmed that I did not belong in his toxic, conditional version of a family, and that was the greatest, most liberating gift he could have ever given me. Worth is not something that is handed to you on a silver platter. It is not something you inherit along with a fancy last name or a trust fund. It is not something that can be permanently granted or revoked by a parent who views you as a financial asset. Worth is built quietly, relentlessly, in the dark, when absolutely no one is applauding for you. It is built in the freezing apartments, in the early morning shifts, in the thousands of hours of unseen, unglamorous effort. Your value does not suddenly shrink just because a flawed, arrogant person lacks the capacity to accurately measure it. If you have ever been the scapegoat in your family, if you have ever been the overlooked child, the backup plan, the one who was told they weren't smart enough, tough enough, or good enough, I see you. I know exactly how heavy that invisible weight is. I want you to know that walking away from toxic family members will feel like profound grief and absolute freedom at the exact same time. It is okay to mourn the parents you deserved but never actually got. But never, ever let their inability to love you convince you that you are unlovable. You are the sole architect of your own life. You are not what they decided you were. You never were. As we reach the end of this journey, I want to leave you with a crucial lesson that took me over a decade of pain to truly understand. The most profound realization I had was this: you cannot heal in the exact same environment that made you sick. We are often conditioned to believe that endurance is a virtue, that tolerating mistreatment from family members proves our strength. But tolerating abuse is not strength. It is self-betrayal. Your peace of mind, your dignity, and your mental health are your most valuable assets in this life. No one, not a boss, not a spouse, and certainly not a parent, has the right to bankrupt your soul for their own comfort. Setting a boundary might mean disappointing people. It might mean changing your phone number, leaving an inheritance behind, or entirely walking away from the table. But the moment you stop waiting for someone else to validate your worth is the exact moment you become truly unstoppable. I would love to hear from you. What is the biggest lesson you are taking away from my story today? Have you ever had to set a difficult boundary with someone you loved? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. We build strength through shared truth. Or, if this story simply resonated with you and brought you value, just drop the word "good" in the comments so I know this message reached the people who needed to hear it. Thank you for listening, and remember, your life belongs exclusively to you.